1953. The Wound and the Witness.
Mossadegh, Oil, and the Unfinished Reckoning by Elias Winter, July 20th, 2025. Read by an automated voice.
Opening. There are histories that refuse to end, no matter how many times we write their conclusion. Some wounds are not erasable, even by forgetting. The world would have us believe that empires dissolve, that nations are redeemed, that betrayals fade into abstraction. But there are truths about power, about loss, about the afterlife of dignity, so deeply threaded into the fabric of a people that to name them is not an act of history, but of reckoning. This essay is not an inventory of Persian pain, nor a monument to the machinery of empire. It is the testimony of the seen and the seeing, of what it means to be shaped by the long arc of betrayal, to refuse the narcotic of forgetting, and to love what remains. If the West tells itself that all wounds can be healed by progress, Iran stands as a living refutation, a land where memory is sharper than hope, where the ghosts of sovereignty and the seduction of power circle endlessly. I write not as a historian, but as an exile and a witness. The story of Iran, like the story of America, is not the story of nations, but of those who live in the shadow of their decisions. We begin, as all reckonings must, not with the event, but with the silence that surrounds it.
Chapter 1. The Land Before Extraction. Persia and the Grammar of Survival. There is a myth, carefully cultivated by empires and internalized by their margins, that the modern world began with oil. But Persia, what the map now calls Iran, knew itself long before the commodity that would make it hostage to foreign appetites. To reckon honestly with what happened in the 20th century, one must begin not with extraction, but with memory, the deep pre-petroleum root system of a nation that stood at the crossroads of faith, empire, and refusal. For more than 2 millennia, Persia moved in rhythms the West could never fully translate. Under Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, the Achaemenids forged a vision of empire that spanned from the Aegean to the Indus, an empire whose grandeur would become both model and provocation for those that followed. But every triumph in Persian history carried its own inversion. After empire, invasion; after conquest, collapse. From the Parthians and Sasanians, through Arab conquest in the 7th century, Iran absorbed and repelled in equal measure, shaping Islam as much as it was shaped by it. The Safavid rise in the 16th century marked the great turn, Persia's embrace of Shi'ism, not merely as creed, but as armor, a refusal to dissolve into Sunni orthodoxy, a wager that distinctness itself could be survival. If Shi'ism was theology, it was also strategy, a declaration that the Persian soul would not be flattened by the machinery of Arab empire. This resistance, subtle and total, is what gave Iranian history its texture, cycles of ruin and restoration, a stubbornness beneath defeat. By the time the Qajars inherited the throne in the late 18th century, Iran was a battered mosaic, a court decadent and hollow, the clergy powerful, the peasantry restless, and foreign hands, Russian, British, reaching ever deeper into the body of the state. Each year, the distance between the people and their rulers grew. Each decade, sovereignty was mortgaged for the next loan, the next diplomatic reprieve. In the 19th century, Iran became not a nation, but a terrain for negotiation, a field on which the great game was played by hands invisible to those whose lives were wagered. Concessions were sold for tobacco, banking, roads, each transaction a quiet evisceration of the public good. The 1905 constitutional revolution was not the work of dreamers. but of men and women who understood that dignity required law, and that law required limits on power. The Majlis, the Iranian parliament, was born from desperation, not utopia, a last stand against the logic of auction. By 1900, Persia stood both ancient and precarious. The city was a memory, the village a fact. The old world was ending, but no new order had claimed legitimacy. The state was brittle. The clergy waited. The foreigner's shadow lengthened. And under the soil, what would soon be called oil, undisturbed, prepared its own judgment.
Chapter 2. Oil and the Invention of Dependence. Britain, Iran, and the Alchemy of Power. History does not always announce its turning points. Sometimes the beginning of an age slips in under the mask of a contract, a signature in exchange for a future none can imagine. In 1901, as the Qajar dynasty stumbled between humiliation and decay, a British speculator named William Knox Darcy purchased from the Persian crown the rights to Iran's buried lifeblood. Oil, still a rumour beneath the sand, was sold for a handful of gold and a future already forfeited. When oil was struck in 1908, it was not the dawn of Iranian wealth, but of a new subjugation. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company, what would become BP, was born as an extension of the British state, a lifeline for an empire that could no longer sustain itself on coal and conquest alone. The steel arteries laid from Abadan to the coast did not nourish Iran. They drained it. British officials became the new high priests of an extractive theology. Iranian workers, their parishioners, were paid in crumbs and broken promises. The British needed more than oil. They needed reliability. Churchill's Royal Navy, the armoured backbone of imperial security, converted to Iranian oil, yoking the fate of a world-spanning fleet to the maintenance of colonial advantage in the Persian Gulf. It was less a partnership than a chemical dependence. Britain would live. Iran would be kept on the edge of subsistence. Its rulers reminded with every negotiation of their own dispensability. Reza Khan's coup in 1921, backed and tolerated by Britain, was a violent wager on modernity. In exchange for authority, he promised order and progress. As Reza Shah, he set about remaking Iran with all the zeal of an autodidact. Railways, courts, uniforms, the violent pruning of tradition. He dared to imagine that a new Iran could bargain as an equal with London. But when he demanded a fairer share of oil, the reply was public humiliation. For most Iranians, oil was never a blessing. It was the visible form of their powerlessness, a resource that enriched foreign shareholders, built company towns where British privilege was the law, and rendered the nation's fate a technical question to be resolved in foreign boardrooms. The Abadan refinery became a synecdoche for the country itself. The labour of the many, the comfort of the few, the sovereignty of none. The interwar years deepened the bind. The monarchy was forced to play modernizer and subordinate, never permitted the dignity of genuine independence. As the world drifted toward war, the value of Iran's oil became not merely economic, but existential, an empire's last insurance policy against the entropy of history. When, in 1941, British and Soviet armies marched into Iran to secure the oil fields and the Persian corridor, Reza Shah was dethroned, replaced by his young son, another body on the chessboard. Oil had become both the excuse for invasion and the guarantee that sovereignty would be rationed, meted out in carefully measured doses, never quite enough for the country to stand unassisted. The machinery of empire had found its perfect fuel, and Iran had become the test site for the new logic of the 20th century. Sovereignty, like oil, would be measured not by right, but by utility.
Chapter 3. Occupation and the Return of the Question. Mossadegh, the Majlis, and the Price of Survival. Empires never leave quietly. They leave their logic behind. In 1941, as the world burned, Iran's neutrality proved its irrelevance. British and Soviet armies invaded in concert, splitting the country in two, excusing the seizure as necessity. Reza Shah, architect of modernization, was shipped off in British custody, an unceremonious exit for a man who believed in the transforming power of control. His son, Mohammad Reza, aged 21, was installed in his place. Young, uncertain, sovereign only in name. The occupation was rationalized as strategic. The Persian corridor became the arterial route for American Lend-Lease supplies to flow toward the bleeding Soviet front. But for Iranians, it was another humiliation. Foreign boots in their streets, foreign decisions determining the arc of their lives. Tehran became a marketplace of spies, interests, and ambitions, each power preparing for the next war, the one that would follow the defeat of the Nazis. In this crucible, something improbable began, the slow rebirth of politics. The forced abdication shattered the monopoly of royal authority. The Majlis, parliament dormant and disfigured, became a site of contest once more, imperfect but alive. The war's end brought new anxieties. The Soviets refused to leave, sponsoring puppet republics in the north. The British entrenched in the oil south. America, the newcomer, learned the mechanics of intervention. Out of this turbulence, Mohammad Mossadegh emerged, not as a savior, but as a threshold. Scion of the old nobility, constitutionalist by conviction, incorruptible by reputation, Mossadegh saw in foreign domination not merely humiliation, but existential threat. His was a politics not of dreams, but of survival. Sovereignty as the precondition of reform. Dignity as the foundation for any future worth living. The National Front was not a party, but an alliance of refusal. Bazaar merchants, clerics, secular liberals, and the newly politicized urban masses. The Tudeh, Iran's Communist Party, shadowed every negotiation, its presence used to justify repression and to caution reformers. Yet the real center was the oil question. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, supported by British might, was both symptom and cause, a living indictment of Iran's truncated independence. Mossadegh's rise, then, was not anomaly, but consequence. A society sickened by managed impotence, rallying behind a man whose sole promise was to reclaim the possibility of choice. As Prime Minister, he would face not merely foreign conspiracies, but the machinery of his own society, the suspicion of the clergy, the caution of the army, the divided ambitions of the urban elite. What unfolded was not a revolution, not yet. It was the re-emergence of the most dangerous question a people can ask. What if we are permitted to govern ourselves? And always, circling overhead, was the unspoken knowledge that in Iran, no question remained national for long.
Chapter 4. Nationalization and the Edge of the Possible. Mossadegh's Defiance and the Weight of the World. Every nation dreams of reclaiming what was sold in darkness. For Iran, nationalization was not simply an act of statecraft. It was an act of metaphysical repair, a wager that history could be reversed by force of will. In the spring of 1951, as world powers watched with a mixture of amusement and alarm, the Iranian parliament declared the oil industry the property of the nation. Mohammad Mossadegh, now prime minister, became the vessel for this collective hunger. Mossadegh was no revolutionary. He was a constitutionalist, a creature of law and precedent, a man more at home in the archives of resistance than on the balcony of power. His genius was negative. He refused the vocabulary of subservience, refused the inevitability of foreign dominion, refused to betray the moment when possibility was still available. When Mossadegh spoke of oil, he was not speaking of wealth, but of a wound. To control the resource was to reclaim the narrative of Iran's existence. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC for its part, was less a business than an instrument of empire. British engineers ran the refineries, British managers counted the profits, British warships stood ready to enforce contracts signed in another era. The refinery at Abadan, largest in the world, became the stage for a new drama. Iranian engineers took the controls, the Union Jack was lowered. There was jubilation in the streets, but beneath the celebration, a deep, nervous tremor. What had been claimed, and what would now be demanded in return? Britain's reply was immediate and unambiguous. The embargo was total. Iranian oil could not be sold. Iranian assets were frozen. Foreign technicians withdrew en masse, leaving machinery idle and thousands unemployed. The world's great powers closed ranks, treating Iran's assertion of sovereignty as a contagious disorder, a threat to the settled order of extraction. Inside Iran, the consequences were swift and punishing. The economy, already fragile, began to buckle. The aristocracy, the army, the merchant class, all felt the chill of global isolation. Mossadegh stood alone, beset by internal saboteurs and foreign architects of decline. The national front fractured. The old order conspired. Even the Shah, king in name, waited in the shadows for the experiment to fail. And yet, for a brief, incandescent season, Iran inhabited the edge of the possible. Mossadegh carried the cause to the United Nations, insisting that justice, not force, should govern the relations of nations. Across the Third World, his defiance was a signal that sovereignty could be claimed even at the price of hardship, that dignity could be lived as a daily refusal to cooperate with one's own erasure. But every act of defiance writes its own bill. The more Mossadegh refused to surrender, the more the world conspired to ensure that sovereignty, for nations like Iran, would remain a beautiful fiction. And so, the stage was set. A small country, besieged but not yet broken, holding fast to the belief that it could, for a moment, choose its own disaster.
Chapter 5. The Gathering Storm. Plots, Proxies, and the Geometry of Betrayal. All empires, when threatened, rediscover their appetite for subterfuge. By the winter of 1951, Iran had become less a nation than a riddle to be solved by those who saw sovereignty as a resource to be managed, not a right to be honored. Mossadegh's Iran, cornered by embargo, haunted by the specter of economic collapse, stood as a provocation to both Britain and America, a test of what the rules-based order would permit when the rules themselves were written in London and Washington. The British, humiliated by their expulsion and the loss of their oil fiefdom, did not bother with the language of compromise. They moved, as old empires do, through intermediaries, funding strikes, printing rumors, buying loyalty from generals and mullahs and urban strongmen. The machinery of disruption was intricate, invisible, deniable. The point was not to win by force, but to unravel Mossadegh's coalition. One anxious day, one bread shortage, one rumor at a time. Yet Britain's reach, by 1952, was limited. Mossadegh, sensing the poison in the well, expelled their diplomats and intelligence operatives, breaking networks that had outlasted dynasties. For the first time in generations, the empire found itself blind in Tehran. And so, inevitably, they turned to their American allies, whose new confidence and ignorance made them both indispensable and dangerous. America's attitude was, at first, ambiguous. Truman's administration saw in Mossadegh a bulwark against communism, a nationalist, but not yet an enemy. The fear, always, was the shadow of the Tudeh, that Iran, left to drift, would fall to the Soviets as China had. The British played upon this anxiety, painting Mossadegh as a gateway to chaos. The oil crisis became a crisis of ideology, a test of containment in a world where any deviation was treated as potential apostasy. With Eisenhower's victory in 1952, the mood darkened. The Dulles brothers, architects of a new American assertiveness, found in the Iranian standoff a proving ground. Under their guidance, the language of mediation gave way to the grammar of intervention. What the British could no longer do alone, the CIA would attempt with vigor and ambition. The coup, Operation Ajax, was not merely a plot, but a geometry of betrayal, designed to fracture trust at every level of Iranian society. Bribes flowed to newspaper editors, clerics, politicians. Instructions passed through hidden channels. Violence was hired and staged. Confusion made policy. The Shah, vacillating between fear and desire, became a piece to be moved, threatened, reassured. As 1953 dawned, Tehran existed in a state of exhausted alertness. No one believed in the stability of anything. Mossadegh, aging and increasingly isolated, faced not only the calculations of empire, but the entropy of his own support. Each institution, army, bazaar, clergy, had its price, its breaking point. The question was not whether a coup would be attempted, but when, and whether the nation would survive its own manipulation. Outside, the world watched. Inside, betrayal was already underway.
Chapter 6. Operation Ajax, the Architecture of Overthrow. To watch a nation from the inside as it is undone from the outside is to experience a kind of lucid nightmare. By 1953, the instruments of Mossadegh's undoing were in place. What began as economic pressure had evolved into something colder, an experiment in psychological warfare, executed with American audacity and British experience. Operation Ajax was not simply a coup. It was a lesson in the new logic of power. Nations could be toppled without armies. Sovereignty could be engineered out of existence. The architects of Ajax believed themselves to be rational men, solving a problem. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the CIA's man in Tehran, saw himself as a player of chess, not executioner. Donald Wilbur, his co-conspirator, drafted the script with a scholar's detachment, convinced that history itself could be persuaded to yield to calculation. The old British hands, humiliated but patient, provided contacts and lessons in plausible deniability. The Shah, always more a figurehead than a force, became both pawn and talisman. He signed the orders because he feared irrelevance, and because the Americans promised him safety, modernity, and the right kind of fear. In reality, he was a man paralyzed by contingency, vacillating between panic and pride. The machinery of the coup operated on every register. Media. Newspapers became factories of falsehood, churning out stories of Mossadegh's supposed communist sympathies, his corruption, his incompetence. Money. Bribes flowed like water. Army officers, parliamentarians, mullahs, and gang leaders each received their instructions and their envelope, the price of loyalty temporarily fixed. Street. Tehran became a theatre for violence and demonstration, with provocateurs paid to stir chaos, create panic, and then pose as the solution. Military. The army's loyalties, already frayed, were tested and retested. Betrayal was a matter of timing, not principle. Kermit Roosevelt, insulated by privilege and adrenaline, moved from house to house, persuading, threatening, orchestrating. His confidence was both his strength and his blindness. History, he believed, would conform to the plan so long as every variable was managed. But Mossadegh, though besieged, was not naive. He shuffled his officers, watched for plots, clung to the fragile legitimacy of Parliament. His defense was neither violence nor propaganda, but the stubbornness of legality, a faith in rules that had already been rewritten. Operation Ajax, in its unfolding, was not a clean operation. It was improvisational, anxious, and, at every step, vulnerable to collapse. Tehran vibrated with rumor and suspicion. The plotters could feel the possibility of failure as keenly as the anticipation of victory. History, in this moment, was suspended. Everything depended on force, cunning, and the ability to manufacture consent in real time. The future of Iran, its democracy, its dignity, its very sense of self, now rested in the hands of men who believed that power, properly applied, could annul the logic of consequence.
Chapter 7. The First Coup Fails, Mossadegh's Brief Victory, and the Anatomy of a Crisis. There is a paradox to power. The more precisely it is engineered, the more chaotic its consequences. In mid-August 1953, the great machine of Operation Ajax lurched into action. On paper, the coup was elegant, a cascade of coordinated moves, timed to perfection, the Shah's royal decree as its ceremonial axis. But Tehran was not paper, and the future always contains more variables than the mind of a plotter can account for. On the night of August 15th, Colonel Nasiri and his men moved to arrest Mossadegh, holding the Shah's order as both shield and weapon. But Mossadegh, the lawyer-turned-prophet, had already sensed the danger. Loyal guards intercepted the plotters, the arrests were reversed, and the night dissolved into confusion. Around the city, what was meant to be a surgical act of regime change became farce. Loyalty, bribed the day before, evaporated. Generals hid or defected. The city waited for a storm that arrived as mist. By morning, Mossadegh was still in power. The coup had failed, and the world was forced to watch a different drama than the one scripted in Langley and Whitehall. The Shah, ever the emblem of hesitation, fled to Baghdad and then Rome, his departure as undramatic as his reign. Tehran's air was thick with uncertainty, but also, briefly, with possibility. For 3 days, the city's mood was electric. Mossadegh denounced the coup as a foreign plot. Naming the enemy was itself an act of resistance. Crowds filled the streets, sometimes organic, sometimes marshaled by the Tudeh. Slogans echoed through neighborhoods that had, until now, only murmured dissent. The old man, for a moment, became the incarnation of national dignity. Not just the head of government, but the conscience of a people. But power is never stable for those who threaten its machinery. The coup's failure exposed the fragility of every institution. The army, purged and uncertain. The parliament, traumatized by proximity to real choice. The streets, alive but unpredictable. Mossadegh's enemies, clergy, aristocrats, old guard officers, did not vanish. They retreated, recalibrated, prepared for the next opportunity. The CIA, having tasted humiliation, refused to accept defeat. Kermit Roosevelt, against orders, remained in Tehran, convinced that what had failed through calculation could succeed through improvisation. For an instant, the world believed Iran might choose itself. But the lesson of the 20th century is that sovereignty, once threatened, does not heal by luck or law alone. The city held its breath, the plotters readied their next hand, and the nation, wounded and hopeful, waited for the second act.
Chapter 8, August 19th, 1953. The Second Coup and the Broken Seal of Sovereignty. History sometimes reserves its final cruelty for those who come closest to redemption. In the days after the failed coup, Mossadegh's government appeared to stand unshaken, exposed but intact, the Shah gone, the streets loud with fragile hope. But beneath the surface, a second tide was rising. Operation Ajax had not been recalled. It had been recommitted, its operatives retrenching in the shadows of Tehran, gambling that chaos could be made to serve the old order. Kermit Roosevelt, agent and author of Improvisation, moved swiftly. Bribes changed hands, new alliances were struck in the darkness, and promises, many false, some desperate, spread through the army, the bazaar, the mosques, and the city's criminal underworld. Money was the grammar, resentment the vocabulary. Tehran became an echo chamber of rumor and orchestrated fear. On August 19th, the city erupted. Crowds gathered, paid, and provoked, then joined by the disaffected and the angry, their motivations as tangled as their banners. The lines between authentic revolt and manufactured crisis blurred until only violence remained. Monarchists, mobsters, and opportunists filled the streets, clashing with Mossadegh's supporters, overrunning government offices, seizing the radio, broadcasting victory before it was certain. The army, its loyalty purchased, its pride manipulated, moved decisively. Tanks appeared. Officers changed sides in full daylight. Mossadegh's home was shelled, his loyalists scattered. By dusk, the balance of power was reversed. Mossadegh himself escaped over a wall, an old man in pajamas, seeking sanctuary from a future he could already foresee. General Zahedi, concealed and waiting, was brought forward as the new face of order. The Shah, miles away in Rome, received word of his victory. Within days, he would return, restored not by his own courage, but by the interlocking machinery of fear, money, and foreign design. The coup was complete, and with it, the brief dream of a self-determined Iran was extinguished. Operation Ajax did more than change a government. It demonstrated the reach of power unconstrained by borders or conscience. In the aftermath, the world's map remained unchanged, but Iran's future was rewritten in invisible ink. Democracy was rendered provisional, sovereignty contingent, memory weaponized. What had begun as an experiment in dignity ended as a lesson in the economics of betrayal. A generation learned, in blood and silence, that no amount of hope could resist a coalition of interests determined to restore the world as it was. But what power forgets is that the memory of humiliation does not die. It germinates, grows roots, and waits for another season to claim its due.
Chapter 9. Aftermath. The Return of the Shah and the Unburied Seed of Revolution. Every coup is an act of amnesia enforced by violence. With Mossadegh's fall, Iran was returned, by foreign hands and local proxies, to the order that had preceded its brief, dangerous awakening. The Shah's restoration was swift and antiseptic. One regime disappeared into the shadows. Another re-emerged, cleansed and armored by the narrative of stability. But beneath the rituals of triumph, the wound was left open, festering beneath a surface of sudden calm. Mossadegh was brought to trial, not as a statesman, but as a traitor to the order he had refused to serve. His sentence, solitary confinement, then lifelong house arrest, became both a warning and a shrine. His followers were scattered, some imprisoned, others exiled, a few executed in the secrecy of cells. The National Front, the movement that had dared to invoke the language of dignity, was dissolved by decree and by fear. The monarchy, now reborn with the blessing of American and British power, shed its uncertainty. The Shah moved to consolidate a new autocracy, armed by Western capital, advised by foreign hands, and protected by SAVAK, the secret police whose talent was to measure silence and cultivate terror. Parliament became ritual. Elections became spectacle. To disagree was to risk disappearance. Yet beneath this machinery of modernity, resentment simmered. The oil industry, superficially nationalized, was apportioned among a new consortium of Western companies. Iran received a slightly larger share of profits, enough to fund highways and palaces, not enough to purchase independence. The dream of economic sovereignty remained just out of reach, transformed into a tool of pacification. In Tehran, the skyline rose, symbols of ambition grafted onto a society whose foundations were already trembling. The White Revolution promised progress but delivered displacement. Land reforms that alienated the rural poor, a consumerism that left the soul unsatisfied, a modernization without meaning. Tradition was insulted, dissent strangled, memory outlawed. But the lesson of 1953 was never forgotten. The humiliation was woven into sermons and whispered in kitchens, carried by exiles, learned by students, and preserved by the very clerics the regime sought to control. The Shah, armored by wealth and surveillance, could not reach the roots of his own illegitimacy. When the next revolution came, 25 years later, it would not be led by nationalists or constitutionalists. It would be led by those who understood that dignity cannot be purchased in the marketplace of empire, and that betrayal, left unatoned, only grows in power. The coup's final legacy was not stability, but inevitability. The new order was a holding pattern, an interlude between one reckoning and the next. The wound remained, unburied and undenied, waiting for the world to remember what it had tried so hard to erase.
Chapter 10. The Long Shadow, 1953, and the Unfinished Reckoning. Some events remain unfinished long after the signatures are dry and the victors have departed. The 1953 coup did not merely shape the destinies of a king and a prime minister. It reconfigured the architecture of trust, memory, and resistance across Iran and the world. Its legacy is not a chapter closed, but a shadow cast, enduring, intrusive, and inescapable. For Iranians, the coup became the original sin of the modern era, the source code of suspicion. Mossadegh's name was kept alive in secrecy, invoked as both warning and promise. Anti-Western sentiment was not the product of ideology, but of lived experience, a lesson absorbed in blood and silence, passed from parent to child. To speak of democracy or sovereignty in Iran became, after 1953, an act of bitter irony, haunted by the knowledge that such words were always provisional, always subject to revocation by unseen hands. For America, Operation Ajax was a revelation that governments could be toppled not through war, but through the deft manipulation of institutions, rumor, and fear. The CIA would refine these methods in Guatemala, Congo, Chile, and beyond. But each triumph carried its own poison. The short-term victory in Tehran was paid for in decades of radicalization, suspicion, and ultimately, violent rupture. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, the hostage crisis, and the enduring mutual incomprehension between Iran and the West all carry the watermark of 1953, faint but indelible. Elsewhere, the coup became a manual, a script for both the powerful and the powerless. Post-colonial societies learned to read every setback as sabotage, every reform as prelude to intervention. The West learned, too late, that managed instability is not the same as order, and that legitimacy destroyed in the name of security cannot be resurrected by force. But perhaps the deepest legacy is internal, the knowledge, on all sides, that history is not only what happened, but what is permitted to be remembered. Iran's wound is not unique. It is the same wound carried by every society where dignity was mortgaged for advantage, where hope was traded for stability, and where sovereignty was treated as a favor, not a right. To reckon with 1953 is to reckon with the logic of empire itself, the machinery that converts lives into abstractions, memory into inconvenience, and justice into a negotiation. For Iran, the reckoning remains unfinished. For the West, the shadow remains unclaimed. The lesson is simple, but unbearable. The world we inherit is not the world that was promised, but the world that was permitted. And every permission is a record of whose suffering was allowed and whose voice was denied.
Epilogue: The Wound and the Witness. The history of the 1953 coup is not merely the record of a crime. It is the long, unhealed rupture between power and memory, between what is done and what is born. There are wounds that refuse repair, and there are witnesses who cannot choose amnesia. Iran, in the half-light of empire's afterglow, lives in that space where the event never ends and the reckoning is always postponed. History, in the imperial tongue, is closure, an exercise in burial, the official end of things. But the true history of the coup persists not in archives, but in the grammar of absence, in the shape of exiles, the hush of censored names, the laughter of children who do not know which inheritance is theirs to claim. To read the 1953 coup as an episode is to collude with forgetting. To read it as prophecy is to admit that some silences grow teeth. Mossadegh is gone, the Shah is gone, and even their tormentors have vanished into the bureaucracy of death. Yet the wound they opened remains. It is present in every negotiation with the West, every whispered accusation of treachery, every plea for dignity that does not dare speak its own longing. It is present, too, in those who left, Iran's exiles and fugitives, who became the custodians of a loss the world does not recognize, and the country itself is forbidden to name. The real legacy of 1953 is not the regime it restored, nor the revolutions it inspired. It is the condition of witness, to see, to remember, to carry forward a truth too costly for the architects of power to admit. The witness is never celebrated. He is tolerated, pitied, or erased. But his persistence is what binds nation to memory, and memory to justice. There are those who still believe that time and policy can heal all injuries, that the world's machinery can recalibrate until resentment subsides and the game begins anew. But Iran's history is the refutation. It is the living presence of what cannot be negotiated away. In Tehran and in diaspora, among the faithful and the faithless, there endures a fidelity to the betrayed and the dispossessed, a refusal to call closure what was, and remains, an open wound. For the exiles, for the nameless, for the vanished and the haunted, there is no promise of return. There is only the dignity of having seen and the duty of not forgetting. The work of the witness is not to write the conclusion, but to remind the world that some histories refuse to end. What began in oil and ended in violence now exists as a kind of prayer, a hope that, in some future reckoning, what was suffered will not have been in vain. Until then, the wound speaks, and the witness listens, refusing the comfort of silence. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.